Since their beginning in the 1980s, transgenic crops have been helping scientists conquer many battles in many different sectors of agriculture. While they have helped produce stronger, more efficient plants, their journey to where they stand today was not as simple as it sounds. Transgenic plants first came into the scientific community in the 1980s when 4 groups of scientists from Washington University conducted the first successful transfer of foreign DNA into another plant cell. Although the DNA came from the same species of plant, it was still a big breakthrough for the scientists responsible. The progression came quickly, as it only took these same groups of individuals a few years until they were transferring genes from across plant species, the first being genes from a bean into a sunflower, as well as putting genetic material found in bacteria inside of living plants. This work revolutionized the way agriculture was seen, both for good and bad. Not only was it a major stepping stone for the scientists working on the project, but it would later pave the way to global-scale pesticides, herbicides, and other resistant crops we see in today's agricultural market. In the 7 years from 1996 to 2003, the United States of America saw a major incline in the use of transgenic plants. Some states and counties had increased as drastic as 75% versus the use of unmodified crops, the most popular being soybean, corn, and cotton. The use of GMOs was becoming an international movement, and why not? Yields were higher, more resistant to weather and pests, and providing more money for the agricultural sector. While the benefits were no doubt large, there were still some drawbacks to these new types of plants. Environmentalists and skeptics alike were quick to question the ethical concerns and safety for consumers. Were they safe? Were there any long-term effects? While we know the answer to these questions today, back in the 1990s, there wasn't as much knowledge, and genetically modified organisms started to gain a social stigma due to this lack of information. In the present day, however, most of society has accepted transgenic crops for what they are: a safe, reliable, more efficient way of producing food and fuel. We see these crops every day, whether at the grocery store or in a farmer's field, and we consume them almost daily. The future of transgenic crops is limitless and has come a long way from the small experiments performed at Washington University nearly 40 years ago. With all the different types of transgenic crops being used all across the world, the 4 that stand out among the rest would easily be soybean, maize, cotton, and rapeseed used for canola oil. Firstly, probably the largest out of the 4 mentioned would be transgenic soybean crops. Back in 2007, 58.6% of the world's soybean crops were genetically modified, mostly used as feed for cattle, swine, and chicken, while also being used to produce many different food additives such as lecithin for chocolate, ice cream, margarine, and baked goods as an emulsifier. Another of the larger groups of crops would be maize. Genetically modified maize was grown for the first time in the US and Canada in 1997. Since then, genetically modified maize production has expanded to more than 35 million hectares worldwide. Today, about 80% of the United States production of maize is genetically modified. 2 common traits that can be found in genetically modified maize would be insect resistance and herbicide tolerance. These 2 are very common amongst transgenic crops since it helps keep the product healthy without needing to spend large amounts of time and money in herbicides and insecticides. Until recently, rapeseed was a relatively unimportant crop, but as soon as plant breeders were able to get rid of 2 undesirable substances, rapeseed started to become more interesting. Today, it is grown not only as a raw material for biodiesel, industrial oils, and lubricants, it is also used as a source of cooking oil for margarine production. For the time being, no genetically modified rapeseed is grown in Europe. Cotton is more than just a fiber for textiles. It is also an important source of raw materials used in animal feed and for various processed food ingredients. Many countries are now growing genetically modified cotton. In China, genetically modified cotton could drastically reduce the pesticide use in crops. Even today, there are mixed opinions when it comes to genetically modified organisms. The general population, however, still tends to have a negative, skeptic opinion towards genetically modified crops. We asked Jennifer Humphreys, a specialist who works with crops at the experimental farm, why genetically modified crops have such a bad name. She said it was due to a lack of understanding and education on the subject, as well as selective advertising. While there are possible risks that do need to be recognized, there are also many benefits and possibilities that people are not being educated on. Some benefits of genetically modified crops include the possibility to produce a much higher yield, herbicide resistance, and climate resistance. This could be useful for developing countries as well as help feed our quickly growing population. Another benefit in some crops can be genetically modified to contain certain nutrients that they would not usually have. For example, common rice is not very nutritious and can cause blindness due to a lack of vitamin A. In developing countries where rice is very common in meals, this becomes an issue. The solution to this is a genetically modified crop called golden rice. It has been genetically modified to be rich in vitamin A, which will help solve malnutrition in many developing countries. Even though genetically modified crops have great potential, there are also concerns that need to be addressed. As briefly mentioned before, some crops are being genetically modified with natural herbicides and pesticides. While there are advantages to this, there are concerns that this might infect insects that are not intentionally targeted, for example the ladybug, creating a lack of biodiversity. Another concern is the possibility of adding or creating allergens. Some genes being used could come from organisms that cause allergies, which could then be transformed into the new organism. Even though there are these negatives, with the proper research and testing, the negatives of genetically modified crops can be eliminated, and genetically modified organisms can